Hello and welcome everyone in the room at Slavery North and everyone online. Thank you for joining us for one of our fellows talks. I'm Charmaine Nelson. I'm a provost professor of art history. I'm also the founding director of Slavery North at UMass Amherst. So we're coming to you from Amherst, Massachusetts, USA. We have another wonderful fellows talk today. We have two more coming up. So I just want to let you know that Dr. Alex Callender will also be presenting on Friday, April 25th. From 2:30 to 3:30. That'll be available online and also here at Slavery North. Again, 2:30 to 3:30 on Friday, April 25th. And then Dr. Kathy Foley-Meyer will be presenting on Friday, May 2nd from 3 to 4 o'clock. Again, available on Zoom and also face-to-face. You want to join us in Amherst at Slavery North. You'll be able to find details of these talks on our website, slaverynorth.com. if you look under the Fellows tab or even on the main page. So thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure to introduce one of our visiting professor fellows, Dr. Julia Jorati. I'm going to introduce Julia and then hand over to her, and Julia is going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have time at the end for questions and for discussion. And of course, you can either type your questions in the chat, and our wonderful Director of Research and Engagement, Emily Davison, will be able to read those questions out, or you can unmute and unmic and speak to Julia directly. So Julia Jorati is a professor of philosophy at UMass Amherst. Her research focuses on philosophical debates about slavery in Europe and the Americas in the 17th and 18th centuries. She received an MA from the University of Göttingen in Germany in 2008, and her PhD from Yale in 2013. In her most recent books, Slavery and Race, Philosophical Debates in the 18th Century, and Slavery and Race, Philosophical Debates in the 16th and 17th Centuries, both Oxford University Press, 2024, she surveys the philosophically most central portions of anti-slavery and pro-slavery texts, composed between 1500 and 1800 in Europe and the Americas, with a focus on how the role of race played out in those texts. In doing so, she explores the association between Blackness and slavery during this period and examines how common it was for white people to view Black people as naturally predestined for slavery. Her project title in coming to us at Slavery North was Enslaved Within the Bowels of a Free Country, Black Anti-Slavery Authors in Massachusetts, 1773 to 1783. Today, though, her talk title is Visions for Life After Slavery and Racial Justice in 18th Century New England. Professor Jorati.
Thank you so much, Charmaine, for this really kind introduction, and also for starting this really wonderful initiative. I've really enjoyed my fellowship so far. So as many of you know, slavery was legal throughout New England until the late 18th century, when Black activists and their allies pushed for abolition. Slides are stuck for some reason. There we go. So for instance, Black anti-slavery groups sent a series of abolitionist petitions to the Massachusetts government starting in 1773. In addition, they sent letters to politicians and published anti-slavery texts in newspapers and pamphlets. There were also many lawsuits in which Black plaintiffs sued for their freedom, for damages, or for reparations. In some New England states, these types of efforts succeeded in the late 18th century. So in Massachusetts, for instance, slavery came to be viewed as incompatible with the state constitution in the 1780s, and other states passed gradual abolition laws. The late 18th century abolitionist movement in New England is fascinating, I think, and it raises many intriguing and important questions. I can only focus on a small subset of these questions, namely the following ones. First, how did Black anti-slavery activists in 18th century New England envision life after slavery? So here I'm not interested so much in the arguments that they gave for abolition, but in what their vision was for what would happen after abolition. Moreover, what measures did they propose to repair the harms caused by transatlantic slavery and to enable formerly enslaved people and their descendants to live good lives? What argumentative strategies did they employ to advocate for these measures? And what kind of future did their white allies and their white critics envisage for Black people? So this is the set of questions I want to try and answer today, or at least partially answer. And I think these questions are both philosophically and historically important, and for several reasons. So if you're not already convinced, let me give you some reasons why I think this really matters. First, I think that this is an important but widely neglected part of the history of African American political thought and of Black history, because this talk will examine some of the earliest known texts by Black political philosophers in America. And there are intriguing connections actually to later developments in African American political thought. This talk explores, for instance, the antecedents of currents such as Afro-pessimism and the reparations movement. And it also explores an important phase in the Black nationalism movement. Second reason, I think it helps us understand the histories of abolitionism, race relations, and racism in the United States. Most scholars who study these histories focus on the South, or they focus on 19th century efforts in northern and southern states to abolish Southern slavery. Debates in northern states in the 18th century are widely neglected, but I think they're very important for a fuller picture of these histories. And as a result of the second reason, I think that this is also useful for understanding present-day race relations and racism, which are closely connected to 18th century racism and race relations. Another reason is that pioneering 18th century anti-slavery activists from New England deserve far more recognition for their intellectual and political achievements than they are currently getting. Many of these figures are not widely known at all, but I think they deserve to be. And then finally, I think that this can also be used to bolster the present day argument for reparations. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. My talk is going to focus on two specific controversies in these 18th century debates in New England about life after slavery. One controversy was whether Black people in New England are entitled to reparations, for instance, as cash payments or land grants or tax exemption. And the second controversy is whether formerly enslaved Black people in New England can or should integrate into majority white communities, or whether they must or should form separate communities, either somewhere in America or in Africa. So these are the two controversies I'm going to use to structure my talk. Let's jump right into the first one about reparations. As we will see, there are some 18th century authors who argue that formerly enslaved people are entitled to reparations. Others oppose reparations, and there are even some authors who claim that white enslavers are the ones who deserve compensation from the government if slavery is abolished. The 18th century texts by Black authors demanding reparations that I have found so far are actually all from Massachusetts. It's possible that there were similar demands elsewhere, but so far I haven't seen any. So I'm going to focus on Massachusetts here. The earliest such text that I found is from June 1773. This is a petition sent by a group of Black anti-slavery activists to the Massachusetts government on behalf of all enslaved people in the province of Massachusetts. This is before Massachusetts became a state. This fascinating and surprisingly bold text demands both abolition and reparations. Felix Holbrook was apparently the group's leader, but it's unclear who else was involved because we don't have a version of this petition that has the signatures attached to it. Holbrook was a prominent abolitionist in Boston who also submitted several other petitions. He was apparently born in Africa, became enslaved as a young child, and was sold to a schoolmaster in Boston in 1750, whose family enslaved him for over 25 years until he gained freedom in 1775, so 2 years after this petition. Let's look at the petition's content, which is truly fascinating. The petition starts, and you can sort of see that on the picture there, The petition starts by enumerating the moral and legal principles that entitle enslaved people to both freedom and reparations. So let's look at the passage that contains these principles. So this is on your handout, by the way, and the numbers should match up with the ones on your handout. So the passage says, your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with other men a natural right to be free, and without molestation to enjoy such property as they may acquire by their industry or by any other means not detrimental to their fellow men, and that no person can have any just claim to their services unless by the laws of the land they have forfeited them or by voluntary compact become servants. The principles invoked here are from the so-called natural law tradition. They're also central to the philosophical tradition called liberalism, building on authors like Locke and Rousseau. Proponents of American independence, of course, famously use these very same principles around the same time to start arguing for independence from British rule and taxation. Let's analyze these principles just a little bit further. I'm a philosopher, I like thinking about principles. So one principle that's getting invoked here is that all human beings have a natural right to liberty, private property, and to their own labor. So in other words, any human being, just in virtue of being human, automatically has a right to be free, to acquire property and keep that property, and to work for themselves. The second principle that's getting invoked here is that people have these natural rights unless they have forfeited or alienated them. Forfeiture and alienation are technical terms in this tradition. So basically, forfeiture means you forfeit a right when you commit a crime, for instance, or violate the natural law in such a way that you lose that particular right. So an example could be the idea that someone who commits murder can be incarcerated because they have lost their natural right to liberty, right? That's one common idea. Alienating a right is slightly different. So alienating a right means voluntarily giving it up by agreeing to a contract, or what in the 18th century used to be called a compact, which means basically that you're selling this right or giving it to someone else in exchange for something. So an example would be an indentured servant who voluntarily and temporarily transfers their right to their own labor to someone else. These two principles were really widely accepted by intellectuals in this period. What is really noteworthy here about this petition is that there's a group of Black people who are explicitly claiming these rights for themselves. And that's noteworthy because it's actually controversial among historians of philosophy whether the white philosophers who developed and founded this tradition, whether they intended these principles to apply to Black people, right? Or whether they only intended them to apply to white people or white men. So the petition then uses these principles first to argue for abolition, and then also to argue for reparations. And the second is, of course, what we're interested in today here in this talk. So let's look at how they apply it to reparations. This is passage 2. Quote, "We are not insensible that if we should be liberated and allowed by law to demand pay for our past services, our masters and their families would by that means be greatly damnified, that is, damaged financially, if not ruined. But we claim no rigid justice. Yet, as we are honestly entitled to some compensation for all our toils and sufferings, we would therefore humbly ask that your excellency and honors would be pleased to give and grant us some part of the unimproved land belonging to this province for a settlement, so that each of us may there quietly sit down under his own fig tree and enjoy the fruits of his own labor." So this is quite poetic, and there's several philosophically noteworthy aspects of this passage. First, the argument here seems to be based on these natural law principles that we looked at earlier. The idea is that enslaved people have a natural right to their labor unless they forfeited or alienated that right. And clearly they have not done either, right? They have not forfeited or alienated their natural right to their labor. And this founds this claim that they deserve compensation for the labor that was wrongfully stolen from them, to which they had a right. Another interesting thing to note here is the claim that rigid justice would financially ruin enslavers, or at least damage them very significantly financially. So that means that the full amount of reparations that enslaved people are rightfully entitled to, would be vast, right? There would be a lot. Think about Holbrook, he had been enslaved for 25 years. So if he demanded back pay for 25 years, right, his enslaver would probably not be able to afford that very easily. So this claim that they're not claiming rigid justice might be intended to make their own proposal look more modest, right? To kind of say, we're actually entitled to way more, but we're only asking this comparatively modest thing. And then another interesting thing to note is that reparations are portrayed as compensation for stolen labor and for damages, and as damages for harms and suffering. And presumably the harms and suffering include things like the deprivation of their liberty. This is actually one common theory of reparations, that reparations are compensation for very specific harms. This means that slavery reparations are based on the same legal principles as the rights of someone who has been robbed of their property or who has been injured by an attacker. So it's the same kind of legal claim. And then finally, it's noteworthy that what exactly they're asking for is that they're asking for land, namely unimproved land belonging to the province of Massachusetts. This could be a reference to land out here. It could also be a reference to land in Maine, which at the time was part of Massachusetts. It's not entirely clear. But they're asking for land that is unimproved, that is not currently cultivated or used. And we should add as a side note, they probably mean not used by white colonists. It was presumably used by indigenous people. This proposal has several advantages from a strategic point of view, because presumably it would not directly affect the wealth of white enslavers, which might make it more palatable, because this was land belonging to the province. It was not private property. It's interesting also that they asked for this land for a settlement. It's not 100% clear, but I think this might suggest that they're envisioning a Black community to be founded on that land, like a separate Black community. And I'll come back to that later. The demand for land reparations is reminiscent of the promise of 40 acres and a mule, a promise that was initially made to Black Americans who were freed when slavery was abolished by the federal government about 90 years after this. This promise was never fulfilled, and it's sometimes used to frame demands for reparations today. This is actually one of the reasons why I think these 18th century texts are important for us today and are important for the reparations movement today, because they help us understand the history of broken promises, injustice, and missed opportunities in the United States, which can strengthen today's case for reparations. And they also help us imagine a different world in which people were compensated immediately after being freed in some way, for instance, by being given land. So imagine a world, for instance, in which Holbrook's petition had succeeded, and every formerly enslaved person in Massachusetts had been given a piece of land somewhere in Massachusetts. Imagine what the lives of Black people in Massachusetts might look like today if that had happened, if their ancestors 250 years ago had been given land. How much wealth would their descendants have been able to build on that possession of that piece of land 250 years ago? Of course, Holbrook's demands for general reparations did not succeed. And tragically, one of the few other things we know about him personally was that he was admitted to a poorhouse in August of 1792. This is the record showing his admission to that almshouse. So this was almost 20 years after the petition and about 18 years after he became free. So he had clearly fallen in extremely hard times, and it seems that he did not get a chance to sit under his own fig tree and enjoy the fruits of his own labor as he would have if the petition had succeeded. There are other authors who demand reparations in the form of cash payments instead of land. One intriguing example is Belinda Sutton. She was a Black woman born around 1712 in what is today Ghana. She was kidnapped and enslaved as a young child and eventually sold to the largest slave-owning family in Massachusetts at the time, the Royals. The royal family had a plantation in Medford, Massachusetts, which they abandoned during the American Revolution to flee to England because they were loyalists. And when that happened, Sutton, who was already in her 60s, gained freedom. And then in 1783, when she was about 70 years old, she petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for reparations from the seized royal estate to compensate her for her many years of unpaid labor. It's a really fascinating text. It includes a bit of an autobiography. She talks about her childhood in Ghana, about the Middle Passage, etc. And then she argues for reparations. Her petition actually succeeded. She was awarded a small pension by the state government. And the same is actually true for a Black couple from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Anthony and Cuby Vassell, who were in a very similar situation. And this, I think, is really important because it shows that there's a precedent in Massachusetts for paying reparations in the form of pensions, albeit only to some individuals and in very specific circumstances, namely individuals whose former enslavers' property had been seized during the revolution. But still, it's a precedent, and I think that is interesting and important. So the argument that Sutton gives for reparations is really noteworthy. She points out that the laws of Massachusetts have rendered her incapable of receiving property and that she never had a moment at her own disposal. So this means that she was unable to save money for old age or to accumulate property. When she finally gained freedom after 50 years of enslavement, she explains she was left completely empty-handed. Due to her age and her ill health, she was unable to support herself or her daughter, whom she also mentions and whom she describes as disabled or chronically ill. And this, she eloquently argues, is clearly unfair and unjust. And this is passage 4. Quote, "The face of your petitioner is now marked with the furrows of time, and her frame feebly bending under the oppression of years, while she, by the laws of the land, is denied the enjoyment of one morsel of that immense wealth, a part whereof has been accumulated by her own industry, and the whole augmented by her servitude." End quote. Okay, so 2 things I think are particularly important about the argument that she gives. First, she notes that enslaved people are entitled to some of the wealth that they helped create. And this is in line with common theories of property like John Locke's, according to which if you mix your labor with something, it's yours. So because the royal family's wealth was acquired through the labor of enslaved people like Sutton and others, a portion of this wealth rightfully belongs to them. That's the argument. And then secondly, I think it's really notable that Sutton describes the current laws of Massachusetts as unjust. She explicitly criticizes the laws of the land that do not entitle her to any part of the royal estate. Her petition hence has a much broader scope than you might initially think. So she's arguing not on the basis of current law, but she's advancing a moral argument going beyond existing law. And while she asks explicitly only for reparations for herself, both of these arguments, I think, the ones on the right, seem to generalize to other cases and other people. There are also other activists who ask for reparations of yet a different kind and based on different kinds of arguments. In February 1780, Paul Cuffey, his brother John Cuffey, and 5 other Black men from Dartmouth, Massachusetts, petitioned the state legislature for tax exemption as a form of reparation. Paul Cuffey, who's the most famous of these signatories, was a Quaker and an entrepreneur, and he was the son of a formerly enslaved African-born Ashanti man and a Wampanoag woman. He later built a successful shipping business and became one of the wealthiest and most famous Black men in early 19th century America. And as a side note, Cuffey would later get involved in the British project of establishing a colonial settlement in Sierra Leone for poor Black people from Britain and for formerly enslaved people from America. He went to Sierra Leone himself multiple times in the 1810s and helped several Black families from Massachusetts settle there. And this relates actually to the second controversy about separatism that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But back to the 1780 petition. The petitioners make several points that we have not seen before, but that are very important. First, and this is passage 5, they say, by reason of long bondage and hard slavery, we have been deprived of enjoying the profits of our labor or the advantage of inheriting estates from our parents, as our neighbors, the white people, do. This is really important because they do not just note that they were not allowed to benefit from their own labor, a point which we've already seen in the other texts. But in addition, they say that their families have not been able to build intergenerational wealth, right, to pass anything down to them, unlike their white neighbors who were able to inherit things from their parents. And this argument is really important because it shows that not only formerly enslaved people themselves, but also their descendants, like Paul Cuffey, who were never enslaved themselves, deserve reparations because they are indirectly affected by slavery, right? So reparations are not just for people who are directly affected, but also for their descendants who are indirectly affected by it. And this is, of course, the argument that is often made by proponents of reparations today, right? That present-day descendants of enslaved people deserve reparations. They then also make some interesting, more general points. This is passage 6. Quote, we poor, despised, miserable Black people have not an equal chance with white people. So this is just a reference to a general lack of equal opportunities. And they spell that out a bit later in the petition in passage 7. Quote, we take it as a hardship that poor old Negroes should be taxed, which have been in bondage some 30, some 40, some 50 years, and now just got their liberty. And also poor distressed mongrels which have no learning and no land, end quote. So basically the idea here is that the lack of equal opportunities includes a lack of access to learning, that is education, and land ownership. So the idea here is that tax exemptions are fair or just because they would help to compensate for some of the unfair disadvantages that are faced by Black people in Massachusetts, both by formerly enslaved Black people and by their descendants. Activists who demanded reparations in the 18th century in Massachusetts were often ignored and also faced significant opposition. As I mentioned earlier, there are even some proponents of slavery who went so far as to say that former enslavers, rather than formerly enslaved people, are the ones who deserve compensation from the government if slavery is abolished. Here's one such text. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time, but it's on your handout if you want to look at it. Let's turn to the second controversy, which is about whether formerly enslaved Black people should or can integrate into majority white communities, or whether they should form separate communities. Holbrook's 1773 petition, which we already encountered earlier, describes actually two possible post-abolition futures. As already seen, the main proposal is that the government should grant us some part of the unimproved land belonging to this province for settlement, and then they also add that they should be granted all the privileges and immunities of the province's free and natural-born subjects. This settlement, as I hinted earlier, might be the idea that there would be a separate Black community somewhere in Massachusetts that would be founded on currently unused land. At the end of the petition, though, they also mention a plan B. So if this main proposal doesn't work, they propose another proposal, and this is number 10. But if your excellency and honors cannot in wisdom adopt this plan of relief for us, we humbly and earnestly request that you would release us from bondage by causing us to be transported to our native country within a short time. So this is a back to Africa proposal. They say, if you can't give us that land in Massachusetts and allow us to settle there and give us the same rights, alternatively, please at least take us back to Africa and allow us to settle there. Intriguingly, Holbrook was also one of the authors of a circular letter that was printed and sent to the representatives of all the towns of Massachusetts in April 1773, so just 2 months before this petition. This letter urged the representatives to advocate for abolition, and it also embraces a back to Africa proposal, but as the main proposal, as the plan A, not just as a plan B. Here's the relevant passage from the letter. We are willing to submit to such regulations and laws as may be made relative to us until we leave the province, which we determined to do as soon as we can from our joint labors, procure money to transport ourselves to some part of the coast of Africa, where we propose a settlement. Okay, so this text seems to propose that formerly enslaved people would jointly raise the money for going to Africa and settling there. The plan B of the petition seemed to be that it would be the government of Massachusetts that would be funding and organizing that resettlement. Okay, so far we've seen two texts that propose a separate settlement somewhere for formerly enslaved Black people. These two texts do not explicitly argue for separatism, for the idea that it needs to be a separate place rather than integration into existing white communities. But there are some other texts that do argue for separatism. So the most common reasons that were cited by Black proponents and some of their white allies for saying it must be separate, it can't be, we can't have integration, we don't want to integrate into white communities. The most common reason is this one here. The idea that Black people will always face racism or will never be happy, fully free, or fully equal in majority white communities in America, or perhaps anywhere in America. There are other white proponents of separatism who give different reasons, namely reasons that have to do with racist ideas or that involve racist ideas. So they argue, for instance, that Black people are incapable of integrating fully, either because of allegedly natural traits that make it impossible to integrate and be equal with white people, or because of traits allegedly acquired in slavery that make it impossible to live on equal terms. And similarly, some white proponents claim that integration would be bad for white people or white society. Okay, so one of the most intriguing separatist texts is a 1787 petition to the Massachusetts government by a very large group of Black men. You can see all the signatures here in the background. The petitioners include Samuel Stevens, Christus Lanzer, Lancaster Hill, and Prince Hall, who appear to have been members of Prince Hall's African Lodge of Freemasons. So Prince Hall is famously the founder of the first Black Lodge of Freemasons. So this petition was sent after slavery had become illegal in Massachusetts. The petitioners argue that even though the Massachusetts Constitution has freed them from slavery, quote, we yet find ourselves in many respects in very disagreeable and disadvantageous circumstances, most of which must attend us so long as we and our children live in America. This and other considerations, which we need not here particularly mention, induce us earnestly to desire to return to Africa, our native country, which warm climate is much more natural and agreeable to us, and for which the God of nature has formed us, and where we shall live among our equals, and be more comfortable and happy than we can be in our present situation, and at the same time may have a prospect of usefulness to our brethren there. So in short, the petitioners claim that there's simply no hope for a good life in America for them, or for their descendants, in fact, or for their children. So what they propose ultimately is they want to negotiate with African governments to acquire some uncultivated land in Africa somewhere. And they think that should be possible to arrange. And then they want to form a settlement there where formerly enslaved people will live and form a civil society governed by a constitution. And they also want to start a Black church there with Black bishops, which may bring what they call enlightenment and civilization to Africans. What they ask the Massachusetts government for in this petition is to help them raise the funds for the scheme, because they say we don't currently have the funds to do this, the voyage and all the equipment, etc. Now, this petition does not really spell out what these disagreeable and disadvantageous circumstances are that they mention. It does, however, hint that it has to do with inequality and that it's impossible to live happy lives in America. There are some other sources from around this time that offer some insights into what circumstances they might be referring to. One such text is Prince Hall's Charge to the African Lodge from 1797. In this text, he's addressing fellow members of the African Lodge, and he mentions how dangerous it is for Black people to simply walk in the streets of Boston because of racist attacks. I won't read this text, but it's passage 13. There are other sources that mention other possible reasons why the circumstances were so unfavorable. For instance, in 1788, there was an incident where 3 Black sailors were kidnapped by a ship in Boston Harbor, and they were sold into slavery. And now other sailors were obviously afraid and worried that they would be kidnapped. And so many of them refused to work on ships and became unemployed. So things like this would certainly explain why petitioners would propose a settlement in Africa and why they were pessimistic about their prospects in America and pessimistic about the prospects for happiness and safety, etc., in America. Before closing, I also want to look at a few white authors who opposed integration. These authors are important in part because some of them express racist reasons for separatism, and that in turn I think is important for understanding the racism that existed in the 18th century, even among white abolitionists. One very common worry that's discussed by white authors is the fear that abolition would have catastrophic consequences for white people if Black people stay in their communities. They worried about things like crime, revenge, violence, and about having to support formerly enslaved people financially because they cannot support themselves. And some also worried about the biological intermixture of Black and white people. One of the earliest texts expressing this kind of worry is actually from 1700, Massachusetts. And this was the first anti-slavery text to be printed in New England, apparently. I will skip the passage in the interest of time, but it's passage 14 on your handout. Another text I'm going to skip in the interest of time is by Thomas Jefferson. This one is not from New England, but from Virginia. So Thomas Jefferson argues against integration in this famous text from 1785, in which he discusses the possibility of abolition in Virginia. And he argues that if slavery is abolished, Black people need to be settled elsewhere. And he claims that in the case of integration, what would happen inevitably is that one or the other race would eventually be exterminated because of tensions that would inevitably arise between the two groups. So this is quite an interesting text. But back to New England. So one of the most intriguing white authors is Jonathan Edwards Jr., who was a Congregationalist minister. And he was actually born in Northampton, Massachusetts, then lived in Stockbridge, studied at Princeton, and became a pastor in Connecticut, where he lived when he wrote this text here in 1791. He was an abolitionist and he wrote several important anti-slavery texts. And towards the end of this particular text, he advocates for integration in northern states, but for a rather unusual form of separatism in southern states. So it's kind of a very strange proposal, but I think it's worth looking at. This discussion starts by him claiming that if you look at human history, there are only two options in societies where enslaved people are the majority of the population. One option is that enslavers and enslaved people will eventually intermix and become what he calls one common mass. And the other option is that enslavers will be driven out by enslaved people. He says these are the only two options. If you look at history, like there's no other way than these two options. And he then applies this to the southern United States and the West Indies, where enslaved people were typically the majority of the population. And then he says something that's truly astonishing. And this is a pretty long text, but I'm going to read it because I think it's just really strange and fascinating. So here's what he says, quote, "It seems that whites in the South will be necessitated by Providence to make in one way or another compensation to the Negroes for the injury which they have done them. In the first case, by taking them into affinity with themselves, giving them their own sons and daughters in marriage, and making them and their posterity the heirs of all their property and all their honors, by raising their color to a partial whiteness. In the other case, by leaving them all their real estates." And then he says, "It's manifest that the compensation in the latter case is by much the least. If, therefore, our southern brethren and the inhabitants of the West Indies would balance their accounts with the Negro slaves at the cheapest possible rate, they will doubtless judge it prudent to leave the country with all their houses, lands, and improvements to their quiet possession and dominion, as otherwise Providence will compel them to a much dearer, that is more expensive settlement, and one attended with a circumstance inconceivably more mortifying than the loss of all their real estates. I mean the mixture of their blood with that of the Negroes into one common posterity. So what Edwards is doing here is he's giving an extremely twisted racist argument for separatism and a very twisted racist argument for reparations, weirdly enough, because he's presenting this as compensation to the Negroes for the injury that was done them, right? So he portrays racial mixture as such a mortifying prospect that he advises white people to simply abandon southern states and the West Indies and give all of their property, all their real estate, to formerly enslaved Black people. He adds that racial mixture will also inevitably happen in the North, but there he says the quote-unquote consolation is that the numbers of Black people in the North are relatively small and that the skin color of white people will not change considerably. So he thinks that's maybe acceptable. So his claim then is that integration can work in the North, but it should not be attempted in the South. Instead, the South should be abandoned and just everything should be given to formerly enslaved Black people, and white people should get out of there. So yeah, very strange proposal. And this is a staunch abolitionist, right? Remember that this is one of the people who's like a staunch ally of abolitionists. Okay, one final text is a fascinating anonymous anti-slavery text from New Hampshire. It advocates immediate abolition throughout the United States, and it seems to be written by a white author because it refers to white Americans as us. So this text actually proposes a solution to the worry that was pretty widespread among white people that formerly enslaved people are not prepared for liberty and would not do well if they are freed. The solution offered by this text is that white Americans must simply teach formerly enslaved people the requisite skills and prepare them for freedom. And the text then proposes that formerly enslaved people from throughout the United States should settle in the new territory, which is presumably a reference to the Northwest Territory in the upper Midwest, which the United States had just acquired a little bit before this, and to form their own state. So there should be a separate state, US state for formerly enslaved Black people. Here's one of the relevant passages about that, number 17. But suppose the Negroes prepared for freedom, are they then to settle among us? Let a portion of our new territory be assigned for the purpose, and let the great body of the Negroes be sent to colonize it. We might reasonably expect soon to see a large province of Black freemen, industrious and well-regulated, improving in arts and learning, happy at home and at peace with us, affording some revenue and adding some strength to the nation. And why exactly does this author think that this is a better idea than integration into existing states? Here's one reason that he mentions, or they mention, number 18, quote, if the Negroes should remain among us, though fully enfranchised, they will not be treated upon terms of equality and perhaps never rise to that rank which they deserve. Let them go, therefore, be formed into a state and in due time have a voice in Congress. They will never be men till they are treated like men. They will never be citizens till they feel themselves so. They will never be good citizens till they know their duties and can appreciate their immunities. There's a lot we could say about this text. I think it's really intriguing. But basically the reason given here is that Black people will never be treated equally in existing white communities. And this is the reason that was, of course, also cited by some of the Black separatists that we examined earlier. Okay, so in summary, we've seen arguments for reparations of several sorts, namely for different types of reparations in the form of land, cash payments or pensions, and tax exemption. And we've seen several different justifications given. One was that formerly enslaved people are entitled to compensation for their stolen labor and their suffering, which was inflicted on them in violation of their natural rights. The justification that formerly enslaved people are entitled to the wealth that they themselves helped accumulate, and that formerly enslaved people and their descendants are entitled to compensation for unfair disadvantages including the lack of inherited wealth, unequal opportunities, barriers to education, and land ownership. For separatism, we also saw proposals for separate settlements in various different locations, on the frontier of Massachusetts, on the coast of West Africa, and as a separate US state in the upper Midwest. The justifications given for separatism were various. One was that Black people will always face racism or will never be happy, fully free, or fully equal in majority white communities in America, or maybe anywhere in America. And then we also saw some racist justifications given, including that Black people are incapable of integrating fully, or that integration would be bad for white people. Let me close by just briefly mentioning a few important implications, though much more can and should be said about this. The first important implication, I think, is that Black intellectuals and activists 250 years ago realized that abolishing slavery is not enough. More than just ending slavery is required to enable formerly enslaved people and their descendants to live good lives. And more is required in order to achieve racial justice. So abolition is just the first step, right? More needs to be done, such as reparations, or maybe the formation of separate communities or colonies for formerly enslaved people. It's also significant, I think, that as early as the 18th century, some Black people believe that there is no worthwhile future for them in majority white communities in the US, or even maybe anywhere in the US, and that the only chance for a good life would be to somehow go to Africa and settle in Africa. And in fact, the racism that we saw displayed by some white anti-slavery authors suggests that the pessimism of Black separatists was quite well founded. Because even some of their most vocal and prominent white allies reject the possibility of full integration on racist grounds, right? So this shows, I think, how widespread these beliefs must have been. And that in turn confirms maybe this pessimism about the prospects. And then finally, the fact that there were demands for reparations in Massachusetts as early as 1773, as well as the content of some of these texts arguing for reparations, can be used to bolster present-day arguments for reparations. I think it's significant that the Massachusetts government considered and rejected a proposal for general reparations to give land to all formerly enslaved people. Because if that proposal had been accepted, the situation in Massachusetts today would arguably be very different. And indeed, because the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts was a model for many other states, similar measures might have been taken elsewhere as well if Massachusetts had done that. I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that wonderful talk. Perhaps I'll just jump in with the first question and then see what's in the chat. Great. Okay, with Holbrook and some others, I noticed that they're pre the precise moment of the Revolutionary War, which I take it is 1775 to 83, if I'm getting it right. Could you talk to us about how these ideas of what you call natural law are spreading through free and enslaved Black communities? Like, is it through churches? Is it spreading from free Black people to enslaved Black people? Of course, I totally get that, especially you saying that many of the people who are behind the petitions were African born, so may have remembered being free, of course, as well. So I'm not trying to rule that out as part of their idea of justice and freedom. But in terms of this philosophical conceptualization of natural law, how is that spreading through Black communities?
That's a really great question. I don't have a super good answer because I don't know exactly how it spread. I do think that as early as 1773, I think these ideas were percolating in Boston and maybe some other parts of Massachusetts, because the tensions between the New England colonies and England were already heating up at the time. And some of the people, including Holbrook, were literate and apparently quite well educated. He was enslaved by a schoolmaster, and so presumably that's where he learned to read and write, I think. So he may have been reading things, he may have been hearing things on the streets, or yeah, so, but I'm not entirely sure exactly how that happened. But yeah, several of the people I mentioned here, including Holbrook and Prince Hall, were literate and may have been exposed to like newspapers and other types of texts. Yeah.
Fantastic, thanks. Emily, can you see if anything's in the chat? I don't think I'm seeing the chat. Okay. I was struck too, Julia, if no one else
No.
yet.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
And then I have, yeah.
Do you jump in?
Okay, yeah.
Please, please.
Just on the Sutton case, and you mentioned there was another case where, was it a couple in Cambridge also?
Yeah.
They also were granted some kind of reparation or compensation. I just wonder, is there any existing case law, anything that would give us an insight into how, you know, the legal structure reasoned these arguments are justified, you know? The law says X, Y, and Z. You know what I mean? I don't know if that exists, but it'd just be fascinating to.
So one thing that's interesting about both of those cases, the Belinda Sutton case and the other case is Kuby and Anthony Bassel in Cambridge. So both of them, they did not file a lawsuit. They petitioned the legislature. So they sent a petition to the legislature, which I think was because there was really no law that covered their situation, in which enslavers simply flee the country and abandon all their property, and then the government seizes that property. So I'm not a legal scholar, but I think that there was no law that would have applied to that, and they basically just appealed to the government and said, this is very unfair. Like we need to be compensated from the seized estate. It's only fair because we've helped generate this wealth, etc. There was, I believe, a law in place that required enslavers to financially support enslaved people in old age, even if they freed them. So it might be that they were piggybacking on that idea and said, the enslavers have fled, but now their estate is in the hands of the government. And so they are the ones who need to now support us because we can't support ourselves anymore. We're too old to work. So it might be that was the legal argument in the minds of the politicians who eventually granted that request.
Interesting.
Yeah.
On that point with Belinda Sutton, what's so striking there, Julia, is for me, when you mentioned that her enslavers were white loyalists who fled to Britain, I was thinking about it too as a strategic decision to leave her behind. Because as she's saying in the petition, she was older, her daughter was infirm, she was likely experiencing some infirmity. And how many enslavers would strategically manumit their enslaved people at a point in their lives just to get rid of the burden of having to take care of them in old age, as opposed to it being some gracious, benevolent gift of freedom, right? So I think it's really interesting that she writes that into her petition, that she's very, very knowledgeable, that she has been abandoned at that moment of her life when she can no longer labor to the extent where she could produce anything for herself that's meaningful, right?
Yes.
Is that how she articulates it? That's what it seemed to be that you were arguing in her petition?
I think so, yeah. I'm not entirely sure about the motivations of the royal family that abandoned her.
Right.
This was after the Mansfield decision in England, so it was already the case that it wasn't very, it was legally complicated, I think, to take enslaved people to England. The common interpretation was that they would have been free on English soil anyway. But one thing that's interesting, I found some similar cases to the Sutton case and the Vassal case from Connecticut. And in Connecticut, these people who were left behind by loyalists who fled the country, they were usually re-enslaved. They were sold to someone else by the government because the government seized the estate, including the enslaved people, and would sell them off to other enslavers, which in Massachusetts, at least in these two cases, did not happen, which is interesting. Yeah.
So we have a question in the chat from Bruno. Bruno, do you want me to read it or do you want to unmute it on mine?
Yes, please. So if you can read it.
Yes, please. It's a bit noisy here. I have a baby at home.
Okay, I will read for Bruno. He says, I have a question. This is truly fascinating. I wonder what kind of knowledge about Africa the African-born petitioners reveal about their homeland. Were they biased? Were there biases around Western and Christian stereotypes? Do they reveal details about their religious background or their family structure, people they left behind when they were enslaved? Do these materials these materials seem really precious for biographical studies. Thank you for your presentation.
Great question. Yeah. So the most detailed biographical text that I'm aware of, or that's among the texts that I discussed today, is actually Belinda Sutton's petition, which contains a description of her childhood in Africa and then of her kidnapping. And she talks about her parents being maybe too old to be enslaved along with her, and so they were left behind, and about the separation from her parents. She talks about the Middle Passage, etc. I do think that a lot of these authors show maybe some bias around Western and Christian stereotypes. So we saw that in the Stevens petition that was asking for the government to help them raise funds to settle back in Africa. And they were talking about bringing civilization and Christianity to Africans in Africa. And there are other similar texts. There are also texts like Phyllis Wheatley's poetry often has similar claims about how in some ways there was like something good that came out of her enslavement because she learned about Christianity through it. So there are these Christian and Western stereotypes, I think, that show up in some of these authors around this time.
Julie, can I just ask you to elaborate for us a bit more on the nature of what you're finding about what life looked like for enslaved and formerly enslaved Black people in Massachusetts at this time? You've mentioned kidnappings going on, like it just sounds horrendous, of course, but how I'm thinking of this is in a larger context. What's so intriguing for, I think, for me and Emily probably as Canadians, because there's two big out migrations of Black people from Nova Scotia that happened around the same time. So you have the Book of Negroes moment where there's 3,000 formerly enslaved African and African Americans who get sent to Nova Scotia by the British because they crossed to the British lines and fought or helped to support the British during the Revolutionary War. They get sent to Nova Scotia around 1783, about 3,000. By 1792, I think a third or 2/3 of them are like, get us out of here. This is not working. They go to Sierra Leone. But what's interesting they didn't petition, I think, the Nova Scotia government. They went straight to Britain. They petitioned the British Crown and they got leave to go, right? And then in 1796, the British had tricked about 600 free Black Maroons in Jamaica who were self-liberated, formerly enslaved people. They said, come down from the mountains and let's have a peace talk. And then they put them on a ship and sent them to Nova Scotia in 1796. And then by 1800, almost every single one of them were like, we're out of here. We are not enslaved. You cannot reduce us to that. We want out. And they petitioned the British Crown again. And they went in, I think, 1800 to Sierra Leone. So this is like the same moment where there's a lot of Black people, I guess, in the Americas who are like, get us out of here altogether. But of course, this is a response to them seeing what's around them is freedom doesn't look like freedom for us here, right? And you describe that, them saying, give us some land away from the white people. Thank you very much, or send us to Africa. So can you talk us through like what did life like? What are you uncovering about lives of enslaved and formerly enslaved people in Massachusetts that's behind that sentiment of we want out altogether?
Right. So I haven't been able to find a whole lot. This is something that I've only recently started looking into. I do think that the Prince Hall text, this is number 13 on the handout. I didn't read that one. I think that one is very telling about just like the everyday situation on the streets of Boston. So maybe I can quickly read that one because I think it's really quite helpful. So he writes, without a great measure of patience, that he's addressing other members of the African Lodge of Freemasons, you could not bear up under the daily insults you meet with in the streets of Boston. How are you shamefully abused? And that at such a degree that you may truly be said to carry your lives in your hands. And the arrows of death are flying about your heads. Helpless old women have their clothes torn off their backs, even to the exposing of their nakedness. End quote. So this is like a really, it seems like a really extreme situation of harassment in the streets. So even just walking down a street in Boston, you're risking your life, right? That's how he's describing it. And I think that would explain, why they would say, just get us out of here. There's no future for us here.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah. Are there any comment from Bruno? Do you want to read that, Emily?
Sure. There are very few first-person accounts of the Middle Passage. We can count them on one hand. Most were written by men. Thank you for showing us these materials. This is fascinating analysis.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Belinda Sutton text is really super
Mhm.
fascinating. It's actually earlier than most of the other accounts of the Middle Passage by men, like Olaudah Equiano is later, Ochoa Cupuano is later. So this is quite, it's a few years earlier than these texts. So I think that's really quite.
And that's part of what she puts in her petition too,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Jorati for a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for being with us today. We hope you'll join us again for our last two fellows talks, which are again Dr. Alex Callender, which will be Friday, April 25th, and Dr. Kathy Foley-Meyer on Friday, May 2nd. Thanks again for everybody in the room as well, and I'll see you soon.